It's time, no? Yeah. You can start?
Or we should wait for 2-3 more minutes?
No.
No? Okay. Alright. Hi everyone. Welcome to ALF Alternative Law Forum. I am Manvi and I work at ALF. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on a Sunday afternoon. And as most of you all must have seen the poster, um, as the year comes to an end, we wanted to have a broader conversation about how we engage with the world of human rights, given the kind of circumstances we are in today. Being lawyers, being activists, students, researchers, we wanted to think about what is it that the act of writing can mean. It is also in the context that this year in 2024 we have seen elections happen at the central level, we have seen it happen in the states, we have also seen the kind of judgments, Supreme Court judgments that have come out, landmark judgments such as the electoral bonds case or the CAA, and it is in that context, and even the 370. And it is in that context that we felt it is important broadly to look at today's present day context, reflect on the last year, and reflect on it through the act of writing. Um, we we have today with us Gautam Bhatia. Many of you will know him. I will give a brief introduction of his work, which is that he's not just an academic and a lawyer, he's also a fiction writer. Recently, his book called The Sentence, which is a science fiction book, has also come out. Previously, he has written a book called The Wall. He also has 3 other works which are unsealed covers, sealed covers, sorry, not unsealed. Unsealed, yeah, it's unsealed, yeah. But for on the sealed jurisprudence, sealed cover, sealed cover jurisprudence, yes. Then the transformative constitution, as well as the shock offender disturb, which is to deal with the freedom of speech and expression question. The reason we felt it was quite useful to have this conversation with somebody like Gautam is also because for 11 years now, he has been running this blog called the Constitutional Law and Philosophy. And for everybody who has any background in law, who has wanted to understand any judgments that come from not just the Indian context but also comparative constitutional context, we have looked at his blog and always had a resource to simplify and to easily understand the key issues and the key context in which the judgments have come out. So it's not just purely legal writing in the way that the law is structured or put out. It is for people who are also non-lawyers and activists who are just deeply interested in understanding law and governance. So it is the 11th year of his blog. Many of his work also include both academic as well as fiction writing, and so we felt it was only right to talk about the question of writing with him. And many of us who are just starting out, we also struggle to write a lot, and we look to him and see how is it that every other day that you are writing and you're not just writing but writing with new ways of thinking and new frameworks from around the world. And so it is with the hope that we'll be able to draw some inspiration and some practice of how is it that we write, what can we do with the question of writing ourselves. With that, I will hand over to you. Maybe you can give your initial comments and then we'll open up for question answers.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me. It's always nice to be back to ALF. I think over the years, many of the book discussions that happened here, I think the first free speech book we had discussion here, and I think transformative constitution as well. Yeah, so on writing, I think specifically for those people engaged in the legal profession or engaging with law in various ways, at least in the context of law in the courts and law in the courtrooms, it sometimes feels that writing about that is a somewhat futile process because unlike in many other countries, there is a fairly big gap in India between writing about courts and analyzing court judgments and examining the practice and the jurisprudence of courts and any kind of discernible impact on what the courts and what the lawyers in court do. So in various other countries, you have this clear feedback mechanism where the academy and legal writing often exists as an accountability mechanism as a check on the courts. So, for example, if you look at the UK, if there is a scathing piece in the Modern Law Review on a judgment, that is going to make judges sit up, is going to make lawyers pay attention, and so in a certain sense, practice is shaped by the understanding that there is a community of people who are there to scrutinize the quality of your judicial reasoning, and therefore that acts as a kind of check upon judges and even upon the way that lawyers frame arguments. Because otherwise, it's of course for good reason a non-elected body. Right? So that is not, and there are many reasons, and we can discuss those, but that doesn't really exist in India that much. So there is no real discernible connection between the critique of jurisprudence and then actual change or movement, or even just an understanding that there is a mutual process where both the practice of adjudication and the practice of critique are equally important, because your judges get upset when they're critiqued. So that I think is just to start by saying that if you think that the goal of legal writing or writing about law is a tangible outcome or something you can see in the near future, you'll often be disappointed. It may happen, it has happened sometimes, but more often than not, it won't happen. Right? So then, of course, the question is, then why do it and why engage in this very specific kind of writing that is critical of or critiques the way that courts decide human rights cases and the practice of human rights in India. So there are a few I think reasons, and one most important is that by design law is an arcane profession. Its vocabulary is non-accessible, and it is only accessible to this inner circle of high priests, right? So lawyers who are trained in legal language and judges who are trained in legal language speak to each other, and that is not open to the larger public. The larger public, doesn't see that process laid out in intelligible language. This is often made worse by the fact that the way we report legal proceedings now reports the most sensational bits of it without actually focusing on the reasoning. So that makes the practice of law both inaccessible to people as well as distorts what's actually going on in court. And this is obviously a problem because the courts are the third pillar of the state, and a lot of democratic functions take place in that sphere. This is even more true for India because over the last 40 years, the courts have grabbed a lot of power, a lot of power that normally courts don't have. So they take decisions that have a huge influence, on people's lives, and they, in recent years, they basically, we've seen courts in their judgments and orders effectively topple governments, restore governments, bring back governments. It's actually a vast and immense power. So what they're doing then becomes really important from a democratic perspective. And so therefore it is then equally important to demystify as an act of democratization what the courts are doing. So for me, one interesting thing about my writing is that this blog at the back end I can see the daily hit count, how many hits are there on the blog, and which posts are getting read and which posts are getting accessed. And over the last 11 and a half years, the one post that has had the maximum number of views is actually a very brief post that only explained what was done on August 5, 2019, Day 370. Right? Because if you look at those two presidential orders, CO 272 and 273, they are written in very Delphic prose, right? So it's just some article getting amended, some article getting changed, replace this word with that word. If you were to come to those two provisions without a background in the entire architecture of Article 370 and broadly the architecture of the Constitution, they would simply make no sense. And yet this was amongst the most consequential pieces of state action in the last decade in terms of its politics and what it did and all of that. And so it is perhaps not surprising that by some distance the most read piece in about entire history is basically just like this 4-para piece that just explained that this is what happened, and this is what has been done. No opinion, like no analysis, just like this is the way it was done. So I think that is one major reason why writing is important, because, and specifically those of us who have had the benefit and the privilege of being inducted into that arcane language, those of us also who are in practice and therefore are able to see from the inside what's happening. Because unlike again many other courts, the Indian courts, you don't really get a picture of what's happening if you read the final judgment. So, for example, if you read a South African Constitutional Court judgment, what is written there is what happened in the case, in the case's outcome. But if you look at here, for example, the toppling of the Maharashtra state government in 2022, it happens through two interim orders of the Supreme Court, which are one line each. That's all. And so it's basically in two lines the government changes. And again, you only understand what those two lines have done if actually you are in practice and you know what interim orders are like, they look like, and how to decode them, and how to read them along with what was argued in court. Because when you look at live law, they have like a live thread. You sort of map that to the order, and then you say, okay, this is what happened. So in India specifically, demystification is of great importance, because not only is the legal language arcane, which is a problem across the board, but the Indian courts act in ways that are non-transparent and very, very opaque. Which is why, again, from an insider's perspective, it becomes important to do this kind of work. I think the second really important reason, I think, is, and this goes to the initial point that you made, which was that, of course, this is not a good time for human rights. It's not a particularly good time for constitutional rights, and just the constraint of state power through law and the constitution. Is that it becomes really important to maintain a record, and so one thing that South African constitutional lawyers frequently talk about is that when apartheid ended, it was relatively easy or easier to re-establish a system that was in some ways adhering to the rule of law. Because in all those 40-50 years when there was nothing of that kind happening, there were lawyers, there were writers, and there were others who kept that tradition alive by arguing in those terms, by writing in that language. And so when you were trying to rebuild, you had that unbroken chain to draw upon. You didn't have to start from scratch. You had this history of writing about the rule of law to just draw upon and rebuild your institutions. So I think that is then a second really important reason why it becomes important to write, even when the writing is not making a direct and tangible impact on outcomes. Which is to say that at some point, these things all happen in cycles, right? So at some point the cycle will turn, the cycle will change. There will once again be a situation where these values or these ideas will matter. And at that point, to understand the various ways in which they were undermined in these years, and what the mechanisms were, will be really important to just have on the record. So recently, for instance, when the Chief Justice retired last month, so I do a piece on the retirement of every Chief Justice, just to set out what they've done, because the powers that a Chief Justice has in the Indian context essentially are huge powers that really shape the whole court. So looking at the Chief Justice's tenure is looking at the court in that period of time and what the court was doing. And the whole piece finally came to around 14,000 words, which is effectively a longish academic article. And some people, when I was just workshopping that draft, mainly to check if there was anything contemptuous in it, they said that it's too long, so you maybe shorten it a bit, just so people can read it like maybe in one go. And I said, well, I think it's better that people read it in bit pieces, and so I'll have a structure that allows that to happen. But there needs to be one place where it's all there together, in one piece, so that the record is complete. To the extent that, of course, we can have it complete, it's there, and so that if you want to check, or draw links between, judicial inaction on, say, demolitions and judicial inaction on, other issues, it's all there at the same place, so you can draw those links for yourself. And that then becomes very important, because again, if you look at the sort of profusion of pieces that came out after the retirement of the Chief Justice, a lot of them focused really on the politics of the court, which is very important. The court is a political organ, the court is a political institution, And so it is really important to talk about judicial politics. The caravan piece, for example, talked about appointments, about the relationship between the executive and the court and the chief justice, and that's really important. And it has a really important value. But I think what's equally important, specifically for those on the inside of the profession, is to ensure that you set out or analyze the conduct of these constitutional functionaries or of the court as an institution with the standard of what a court should be like in mind or in view. So if this is what a constitutional court that is cognizant of protecting individuals and individual rights and collective rights from the state and from powerful private interests, if this is what that institution would look like in the ideal situation, then how does the present fall short of that? In what ways? And just do it in a very, in a way that uses law's language and that shows how internal to the practice of constitutional law it's falling short or is not, really getting to where it should be. So I think that internal, comparison, that internal analysis that says, okay, look, this is the way that the rule of law should work, and this is the way it's not working. Then I think again is really an important aspect of just setting out the record. So I think that these are like two reasons why I think writing in the present time about adjudication, constitution, constitutional law, and rights is important. One, that it demystifies and democratizes this really important political practice in our society, specifically for those who are not inducted into the language and its many nuances, so that they can understand what's happening and then take action on that basis. And the second is to create and construct a record that engages with what's happening on its own terms and from the perspective of what it should be like, but what it isn't. And of course, I mean, the other two sort of very instrumental reasons. Third, more selfish reason is that you write if you enjoy writing, and so you write if it's fun and if it's enjoyable and just constructing language sentences is fun for you. That's the best reason to write. And I think that brings me to the second part of what you asked, which is just how does one go about the practice of the craft of writing. I think there are two or three things I would say. One is that something a legal writing professor of mine once told me, which was that writing is like a muscle. So the more you exercise it, the easier it becomes. The less you exercise it, the harder it will become, and then the more chances of bruises, injuries, and so on. And that really is I think it's entirely true. So the more often you write and the more frequently you write, the easier it becomes. And so some people often ask, how is it that the piece comes out so quickly after a judgment, and the pace is quite, how is it so quick? So it wasn't always like that. So, but if you've been doing something, say an average of twice a week for 10 years, at some point it becomes muscle memory almost, right? So when the judgment comes out, you already know which parts you can safely, skip. Like the long parts where they recount the facts or they recount the submissions, you know where to go immediately, you know how to extract the meaning from it quickly, and you know how to articulate that in words. But that is not something that happens on the first occasion. On the first occasion, it's always difficult, it's always uncomfortable, it's always forbidding, it takes time and effort. But if it is something you've been doing for 10 years, almost every day or twice a week, then it comes easily. And if you stop it, then again it'll go. So it's not that it'll just stay with you. So you have to keep doing it, keep at it, in order to just ensure that you internalize that. And this is, I think, more for non-fiction. I think fiction has its own different rules. But for non-fiction writing, and I think writing about the courts and the law, that is something that's important. I think a couple of other things just about style. So I think it's very easy, those of us who are in practice and who do drafts, it's really easy to slip into some very bad habits that are there because of just long-standing traditions. So using passive voice, using words like here and after, here as under, and so on. So many times I have guest posts on the blog, and when submissions come in, I see words like here and after or there under. You could just say as follows, right? So or see below, right? So that's just so much easier. You're a reader, would thank you for it. So I always cut out those words and tell them that don't use words that you may think that a draft requires, because ultimately your draft has a captive audience, a judge who may or may not read it, but that is the audience for the draft. But when you're writing for the public, then you need to create your audience, and you will not create an audience if you use language that puts people off, right? So use language that's as simple as possible. It doesn't mean dumb it down. Obviously, don't dumb down stuff, but use simple language, and try and not communicate more than one idea per sentence. So let the readers pause after a sentence, think about your idea, and then move on to the next one. So long sentences is again something I find a common problem in guest post submissions. I think again just bad habits from drafting. It doesn't really matter what the sentence is or how long it is, but just like this is something as basic as having one idea per sentence really helps a lot. And I think of course the third thing which is underrated is read a lot, read a lot of good writing. That's the best way to pick up the craft. And so when I did a legal writing course when I was doing a master's abroad, so the way it was structured was that every week we were given by our professor, who was a New York Times legal journalist. He used to give us 3 or 4 pieces that were in his view, that were the best expositions of writing in a particular genre. So, for instance, one week we had true crime as the genre. So we had In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. So we had parts of that. Then one week, if it was journalism on the Supreme Court, you'd be given like the 4 or 5 best pieces by the top journalists who cover the Supreme Court. If it was labor law one week, then it was some of the most evocative histories of the American labor movement. So yeah, so it was basically law adjacent fields, and in each week you would be given the best kind of writing in that subfield or sub area, and then we'd be encouraged to think of what makes that writing good. So if it moved us, if it stirred us, if something we enjoyed, to think about what is it about it that we enjoyed. Was it just the language or the build up, or the way that the writer approached the issue? Yeah, and over the course of a term, that really helped. So I think that focusing on what you're reading and seeking out good reading, and then seeing what works and what doesn't work, is a good way to go. And of course, ultimately, finally, it's practice. So the more you practice, the better you'll become at it. So I think that I'll stop at that, opening remarks, and go into a discussion or conversation.
Maybe before we do that, do you want to also speak a little bit about your switch to fiction, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there must have been some thought process to it. There are many people who also are keen to learn how to do storytelling, to also talk about these present times, right? It's only not the use of law or implications of the legal language in that sense that can communicate the struggles of today.
Yeah.
So what is it that drove you to that shift, and how did you have to also change your practice? Because
Yeah.
fiction is a-
So first of all, there was no shift. I mean, so I've been I've loved writing fiction since I was a child, since the age of 10. So trunk is full of old teenage novels. Obviously, will never see the light of day for good reason. And specifically if you're reading fantasy and SF, there is a whole world of fan fiction in these genres, where you take universes others have built and then write in them. It's a really good initiation into writing fiction. Fan fiction is a great way to start, which I did along with many others who are now fiction writers. So it came much before law was ever a thing. So you go from being a fan to a fan fiction writer, and then finally to a writer. So it preceded law. But as to what to unlearn and the difference. So of course, I mean the biggest difference or the biggest thing to unlearn from one to the other is that in law you're doing the written word, right? So it's always the written word that you're focused on, and in a lot of fiction is dialogue, so spoken word. So moving from written word to faithfully portraying human dialogue, or even in the schematized way it is portrayed in fiction, is a big challenge, and it requires a lot of work, a lot of unlearning. One technique is to read to yourself aloud, read your work aloud to yourself, see if it actually is flowing. If your ear will pick it out, your ear will pick out the dissonances and the disharmonies. So you'll see that if something not working. But of course, have good editors, have good readers who will tell you it's not working. The second, I think, more harder challenge is that legal writing is meant to be direct, precise, and to the point, and brevity is really at the heart of it. And I mean, as when you're doing a legal draft, or you're doing, or even if you're writing legal op-eds or legal blogs, you're obviously advocating the point of view, which in your view, in your view is the correct, is the truth, right? So you are speaking what you think is a truth or the truth in the clearest way that you can manage, which is direct, to the point and precise. In fiction, there are no truths, so you not, if you try and use fiction as a vehicle to put forward a point of view, it's not going to work. It's going to be bad fiction. You have to approach the issue indirectly, approach it through various devices, metaphor, imagery, all of that, and and of course, fiction is all about the flourishes, and the way that you make a point through the device of language. So in fiction, the language is actually is a protagonist. It's playing a role, whereas in legal drafting, the language is meant to really just communicate the message, and the language is not meant to overall take center stage. Right? So in that way, writing non-fiction and fiction is very different. The most important, like I said, is actually legal drafting is direct, and it's about truth. Fiction is indirect and about raising questions. Right? I think it brings me to this another point you raised, which was that using fiction to write about present times. I think again, I think it's important to be careful, right? So of course, like people do, and people have used fiction as a commentary on the present. That is very much part of writing fiction. But there is a risk involved in that, which is that either you will turn fiction into an allegory, which again will mean it's a bad story, because nobody again really wants to read an allegory when you have like the real life right there, right? Or it'll become didactic, right? So you're basically trying to drive a lesson home into your reader. And again, no reader likes that. No reader enjoys being told how to think, or being told that you're reading this book or this novel for moral improvement or for ethical improvement. Nobody likes that. So again, the challenge is there, that if you do want to talk about an issue, which is of course that's the point, to do it in a way that is more about making the readers think for themselves than giving them an answer. So you frame the question for them perhaps in a way that they hadn't thought of before, but then it's job to think is there. So for example, in the recent novels, which you mentioned, the sentence, death penalty is like a really it's a core part of that novel, and the premise is that they invented a way of freezing people in a cryo chamber, so they replace death penalty with reversible death penalty. So if you're sentenced for a really heinous crime, then you're put into that cryo box, and if later you're proven innocent, then you can be revived. Now that speaks to many debates. For example, is the only issue with death penalty its irreversibility, right? So if you were to find a solution for the irreversibility of capital punishment, would it then be okay, right? Is infallibility the major issue? So now if you can correct your error but later on, is it okay then, right? So but of course you don't then drive those debates down your readers' throats. They come through the story, right? So if you have a story where this is the premise, then on its own those questions will come. They'll come when the characters grapple with bringing back someone from the dead or not, things like that. So then let the questions emerge from the story, and the story has to play the primary role, and the ideas will come from there. I think that's like really important to keep in mind. That don't think of starting off by, okay, I'm going to take this issue and use fiction as a vehicle to put out my point of view. It's more like, here is a story that really overlaps with this issue, and this is how I'll tell the story so as to frame these questions. This is actually, in fact, a lot of this comes from Spanish writers. So there is this really interesting book called the Op-Ed Novel, which talks about the way that Spanish writers, after the fall of Franco in 1980s onwards, were both really prominent. They were both really prominent op-ed writers in the pages of the Spanish newspapers, El País, El Mundo, all of those newspapers. And they were also novelists. So Javier Marias and these big names you see in bookshelves, they did both. And this book studies the overlaps, and finds that actually what they were doing was that if they had a social idea or an idea, certain kinds of ideas, they would use the op-ed page to really elucidate and crystallize the idea, and then use the novel to explore it in ways that the op-ed page could not do. there's this whole debate about what do you do with the Franco era? Do you move on from it? Do you seek justice for it? Do you try and prosecute people who were involved, or do you just do that? So and so in the op-ed they would take stands and they would take stances, on that. In the novels they would have characters who would be grappling with that, but there wouldn't be like a clear stand you take, to which you then impose on the reader. So this is how you can explore similar ideas. So I, for example, in op-eds have taken a very, very clear anti-death penalty stand. I've written about the various reasons why death penalty, should not be there. And I can't do that in the novel, but I can, through these stories, push the reader to think, okay, is this right? Is this wrong? What are the considerations there? So I think that was something to keep in mind if you're writing fiction that seeks to interrogate or understand present day issues.
I think we'll just open up for questions now, something that maybe we can come back to after we have 2-3 questions here. That Arvind and I were also talking about that, like you said, along with writing is the reflexive exercise of reading. Right?
Yeah.
So, what are some of the books, like you were talking about, some books that help you get a grip of different kinds of writing?
Yeah.
So, something maybe in the last 1 year, or some books that you've read that stood out to you, and why, right? The question of why, which is really important. And maybe if you could speak a little bit more to, you spoke about how it was important for you, and that you found it a useful exercise, and that you really loved writing. But for those of us who are still struggling to find out, one, if you're good at it, what is it that what are some questions to ask ourselves, and how to really get at the part that, okay, if you make it a muscle, it's something that can, if you exercise it enough, it will work. So if you could talk a little bit about this, and then we'll
So on the second, I think that it's that I think one is to have a really good group of people around you who will read the writing and tell you honestly, but also in a constructive way what they make of it, right? So this is of course a lot more the case in fiction than in non-fiction, but also, I think also at least starting off, to have people who will tell you, okay, look, this doesn't make sense, or this paragraph does not make sense. I'm not getting what you're saying. Can you communicate it in a more direct way? I think all of that really helps to have a group around you that will, without any judgment, but with honesty, read your writing and tell you, right? So I think that's one thing. On whether you love it or not, whether you want to make it a master or not, I think again it's in the beginning it's meant to be difficult. It's not easy. In the beginning, I think all loves, it doesn't come easy, right? So you in the beginning it will have or demand that effort. But I think the signs will be there, right? So you have to really, for instance, if there is a moment where something comes together and you really feel that joy that, okay, this piece has come together, or even just the sentences come together, the sentence level, right? So I think then that this is something for you. But if it is just relentless, sort of misery, then it's not worth it, right? So not everyone should or can or even needs to be doing writing. There are other things to do as well. So if it is non-stop pain, and if it's this discomfort throughout, then at some point it may make sense to say, okay, this is not the thing I enjoy. But in the beginning, if it is uncomfortable, but nonetheless there are moments which which stand out, then I think then it's something worth then working on and practicing. It is like in the craft, it requires some degree of effort in the beginning before it starts to be enjoyable, right? So I think that's something worth keeping in mind. And of course, beyond that, like I said, the more practice, and it's not essential that from the beginning you write to be published or write just for public. You can in the beginning even be writing, for yourself, or just writing to practice, or writing just to get the itch, or just to scratch the itch. Ultimately, of course, writing is a public-facing act, right? So it is about, unless you're journaling, which is of course different. Writing is a public-facing act. It is written for an audience, whichever the audience is. Sometimes sometimes you don't. Sometimes the audience comes into being as you write, but it is for an audience. So I think that's something which is worth keeping in mind. On books, I mean, I think a little bit. I check my Goodreads list, I record all the stuff over there. But I do recall, I mean, some good writing in the legal, field that I think is really, which I would recommend. Just in terms of, I think, really fantastic writing on a particular issue, right? So there is, for instance, this really great piece in, I think it's Slate or Salon, or one of these American outlets which is about the whole Brett Kavanaugh hearings when when he was elevated, and then there was the accusation of sexual assault, and then what happened after that. And it's I think it's called Why I Cannot Go Back to SCOTUS After Kavanaugh. It's by one of those very I've forgotten her name, but one of those very prominent American Supreme Court journalists. It's a really good piece that explores the minimization of sexual violence in public culture, and what it feels to watch it happen in that context. And it's really well written, and it shows you, I think, the power of the personally reflective piece, dealing with issues around constitutionalism and rule of law and so on. I think it ends with this really powerful line saying that that she says that she's not going to go back to the Supreme Court despite having spent so many years covering it. And she says that my beat is now justice, and the latter beat means the former beat is no longer, like, no longer do it. So it's really, like, really powerful way to end that piece. So that's, I think, one piece I would recommend. Another piece is this piece by this anarchist collective called Crime Think Incorporated, called Against the Logic of the Guillotine. And it's basically about political violence, and why seeking political violence as a form of revenge or vengeance is a dead end, right? So the guillotine has the image of, now you've overthrown the royalty, and then you guillotine them as an act of, it could be revenge, this could be, not wanting to have them there while you build your new society. But basically, why political violence is a dead end, and why anarchists and leftists should think of it that way. It's again a really good piece that talks about that, and of course political violence is something that's always a topic of discussion, Marxism, or etc. Right? So there's that piece. Camus' Against the Guillotine on death penalty, I think, is another really fantastic piece that I have really found. Again, like, it's the power of, like, a philosophical piece but written accessibly, right? So it takes all the philosophical arguments and then deals with them, but in a very accessible way. And yeah, finally, there's this fantastic book called Which Side Are You On, which is about the history of the American labor movement and their attempts to constitutionally, like, fight against banning of strikes and so on. So it's a whole history, and again, one of the best written books I've read. Just taking, like, a complex legal history and just making it just like a thriller, right? Like a piece of historical fiction, right? So yeah, that's some of the things that come to my mind. But I'm sure more will come if I think more. Yeah.
Thank you. You can now open it up for questions. We take 3 questions at a time, so raise your hand and then, yeah.
So, do you use ChatGPT personally for any of your work? Do you see yourself, or perhaps if you haven't, do you see yourself using it in future? And how do you see it shaping thinking for 2 sets of people? One is for whom it's just part of everyday life, for the younger
Can
people.
we request you to talk loudly?
I'll try. Okay.
It's not
So,
fair, no?
Okay, I'll try to shout. I want him to tell if he has used ChatGPT or generative AI, or if he hasn't, does he intend to use it, and how does he see affecting 2 kinds of people. One who have grown with technology, for whom this is perhaps something unnatural, just warming up to it. For future generations who might think that this is part of life and this is how. And do you see ourselves surrendering a part of thinking that goes into writing to an algorithm?
Take one more time, answer one.
No, we can take 2 at a time.
How important is journaling as not just a means of expressing oneself, but also in trying to get started with the process of writing?
Yeah. So ChatGPT, I mean, so I think, like, everyone who is a little narcissistic does. I once put into ChatGPT, like, who is Gautam Bhatia, and it told me that he is also the Enchantress of Florence, wrongly attributed to Salman Rushdie. And so after that, I've never used ChatGPT after that, because apparently I am the author of The Enchantress of Florence. But no, I mean, to answer the question, I have never needed to use it so far, because, like, all my work is analytical, right? So the material is there in front of me, and the whole point of my writing is to analyze that and to have to express my view on that. So in that sense, what ChatGPT can give you effectively right now, which is summaries of say a judgment, is not what I'm working on. So I don't need to use that. I have found students using ChatGPT, to summarize their essays, which is of course unpleasant and not nice, but they do it. So I think you do have people, but I can see, for example, if your work requires you to like have summaries of long and complex material, which you don't have the time to really like break down because you have other work to do based like launching off on that, I can say it might be of use. And of course, then as it becomes better and better, it may also then become a better analyst. So there is that. In fiction, is a big issue right now. People are using generative AI to write novels and poetry and stories. And on Amazon now, it's really like they upload these books to Amazon. It's a massive issue in many science fiction magazines, since that's the space I'm in. Have a no ChatGPT policy, and if you're caught, then basically you're banned. So yeah, it is a bit of a push and pull right now, and I think I think that ultimately you'll have a situation where human authored fiction will become sort of like that artisanal fiction. So if you want your comfort read, you can have a generative AI book that deals with the theme you want to like read on. If you want to like read something that is artisanal, then you get a human like written books. I think it won't replace human writing, but I think it'll sort of alter the way like the industry functions. On journaling, I think it's really helpful because for many reasons you may not want to write in public to start with. You may just want to practice a craft on your own and by yourself, and also just articulate ideas to yourself before you articulate them in public. I think it really helps in doing that. But again, to each their own. Like some people can do it without, some people can do it with.
1, 2, 3. Yeah.
What's the writing process look like? How much of it involves reading, writing, rethinking your ideas, maybe taking a walk? I don't know. In a different type of writing process. So
Sorry, writing what? Sorry?
Writing process.
Process. Okay.
So that.
Gautam, so you've been writing for 11 years now, right? And clearly you have a big audience following. So you're an important figure as a writer, but also people follow and take you very seriously. So with that kind of great power, what's the kind of responsibility? What kind of responsibility do you think it comes with it?
Yeah.
Can you reflect that? And the second part is, are there instances where you've got things wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, you misread something.
Yeah.
You got it wrong. How you dealt with that?
Right.
So maybe a little bit of the fallibility of
Yeah.
the writer as well.
Yeah.
How do you see incorporate dissent into your non-fiction writing, and how do you kind of navigate through states of censorship
Right.
when you're doing
Incorporate dissent, as in dissenting through writing, basically. Yeah. I mean, so I think that it is. I think that any kind of critique of the quote is sort of, you ultimately end up dissenting because they're so hostile to any criticism, right? So judges are so hostile that even the softest and mildest of critiques, they get angry. So in that way, just doing this is automatically, you find yourself, even though you may not, choose it, you find yourself, in that position of some kind of a dissenter. I think censorship, this is really like a difficult issue because. So for a long time, I wrote whatever I wanted to. Like there was no question of censoring or anything of that kind. But then there came a point where what I wrote was being read, which is great, but also then linking to something that you made. Then suddenly you find that people are actually looking out for what you're writing, and then I think like maybe around 2017 or something, for the first time after a piece, I got a call from like well-wishers who said that who were themselves like in the system, who was saying, judges for example, saying that like please tone down this piece because you will create enemies that for no reason. You can make the same point without using that word or those two words or that phrase. And my dad used to say, and he still says the same thing, although he incredibly enough he found the latest retirement piece too mild, so that was something strange. he always said that you're like you can actually be more effective by through understatement, right? So if you actually, if you use the devices of irony, of humor, of understatement, you will be actually more effective than going like blunt, and sort of, going hammer and tongs. So that is one thing. So how do you navigate that? And of course, I mean, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's much more direct pressure, on writing, and so then it's inevitable that it will affect the way that you write and what you write. And not in the same, again, it's not that you will stop writing about X or Y, but you are a lot more careful about the choice of words, and just the sentences and what you're saying, because you're aware of, and that's how chilling effect works, right? So you're always thinking, that will this lead to X consequence or Y consequence, right? So you try and make sure you're still making the point in a strong way, so not dilute the message, but you are just a lot more cagey about the phrasing and the words. So I think that's effectively what's happened, at least to my work over the last 3 or 4 years, which is like just a more caution with the way. And sometimes you do make the point, but you make it ironically, right? And you make it like in a way that people will understand, but it is still ironic. So there is plausible deniability to what you're saying. So I think that's essentially been like the process that I've sort of gone through in recent times. Yeah. So on fallibility, what was the first point? Oh, responsibilities. Yeah. So I think that one aim, in at least as far as the blog is always has been to also welcome people who take other points of view, from mine, which has sometimes worked. So there have been pieces on the blog that have for example, argued that the abrogation of 370 was constitutionally valid. It was actually like the procedure was valid. And then somebody argued, there was a piece saying that the EWS reservation is also legal. So these are stands that I don't take, but they're well argued for. I say, okay, of course there are lines. So so recently someone submitted like a piece saying that the Supreme Court was correct in dismissing that Israel petition. I said, like, this is my red lines. I'm not going to publish a piece that makes that point, and I don't care if it's argued well or not. That's just a personal red line. So I think I think one thing is to try and make sure that even though your stands are very clear, the space that you administer, which is the space you will come to, is more diverse and not just your points of view, which again is a little hard, because after a point, then it becomes a self selective thing, right? So people who have strongly right-wing views will not submit to this blog, will submit elsewhere. And it's not because I've said I won't accept it, but because if for 11 years the blog is very clearly a left-wing blog, then you sort of So I think that's a bit of a challenge. Have I got it wrong? I think that many times. In fact, the book that is coming out this next year will be repudiating transformative constitution, right? So basically, I'm sort of saying that everything I've done for the last 5 years is wrong. So you may. So I think that's an example of like getting things badly wrong. I think so. Once that comes out, then we can do a discussion here. I think. There was a process. Yeah. So I have this very different process for non-fiction and fiction. So for non-fiction, it's always a clean first draft. So it's just the first draft normally is the final draft, and that's how it normally works. For fiction, it's like complete opposite. There are like I think 17, 18 drafts, and you go from like hating what you've written to just sort of mildly disliking it, and that's where you say, okay, like now I've come to the point where it's fine, I can go out in the world. So I think it's just different, and I think everybody's process is different. Some people really like refining through drafts. Some people want to have a daily word count. Some people use tools like Scrivener, to write. Very helpful for me, at least for fiction. So I think everyone has a different process, and there's no one size fits all process, at least as far as the thing gets written. Whatever process takes you to it is fine.
Yes, is that you? Then behind you, and then.
Okay. My question is about your style, moving from non-fiction and legal background to like fiction. That's something I struggle with. That legal and academic writing has like a tone. There's not much variation of style required to get your message across effectively. But that's not the same with fiction. So how would you? And it's also an expression of yourself or your will. So how do you navigate that change? And how did you? and also over time,
Yeah.
change of style. How would you
Yeah.
like if you want to change your style after
Yeah.
a couple of books because
Yeah.
it gets monotonous?
Yeah.
So what do you do then?
Right.
Is my question.
Right.
My question is slightly related. Like, how is your legal background, both in India and then abroad, how has legal education impacted your writing?
Yeah.
And the second part, for formative law students who are,
Yeah.
who have just been in the field, what is your advice on, them getting started on this
Right.
writing?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, my question is twofold. One is I kind of agree with your dad's assessment about understating. Because one of the things I have struggled over the years in 4 registers of writing. One is academic writing, one is public writing, and the third is writing with campaigns, when you issue a statement.
Yeah.
And the fourth is fiction. So
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
about the first 3.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to one of the things I've often seen when campaign statements come out, it's very direct. It's you need to be disappearing from the planet and so on.
Yeah.
Now, initially I used to like this tone, but over the years I wonder whether that tone works because you're going to polarize the audience.
Yeah.
Now that leads me to the next point, which is connected. I often worry or wonder about the utility.
Yeah.
So I may have gone through 20 drafts and written something,
Yeah.
but then in the end I feel, what's the point? So when you feel that way or think about the utility and the futility of writing, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So on the first point, I think polarization is not always a bad thing. So sometimes if you look at, and this is a common example, right? The civil rights movement of America in the 60s was polarizing for a long time. A majority hated it. They were direct. The slogans were direct, and people did not like it, and they did not have popular support. But it got done. I mean, what they wanted, at least through legislative changes, they achieved. So it's not always. I think polarizing isn't always a bad thing, but it depends on strategy and what you think strategically works for any given situation. So if you think it would work, then direct is good. If not, then of course making it more understated is better. So I think this is a very contextual thing. On fidelity, so I think like the thing is that like with words, I mean, you're not in control of what they do once or what happens. Their impact once you've written them, right? So you're not in control of whether it is something people will read or not read, or if it will just be into the void. But I think all you can do is ensure that if it has an impact, it's a good impact, right? So, so if people read it and if it is there, then it has a good change in the world. So at least don't write stuff that would then be misused or abused by people. I think that's the only thing you can control. You can't control whether it will actually be read or not. That's not within your control. Of course, you can maximize your chances by writing in a certain style, by not being inaccessible, and just by practicing writing craft. But beyond that, just having an audience is so dependent on things beyond your control that it's not something that you can ever really plan for. But I think what you can do is make sure that if there is an audience, then it will be something that's for the good and not for the bad. How is advice to people starting law school? I think one really good way to start is to do case comments, right? So before you start writing academic articles or analysis of whole domains of law, which is much harder, much more challenging thing to do. Judgments come out yesterday. Let me analyze it because A, it is new and it is a contained thing, and B, you have a chance of saying something actually new because you are starting off at an equal place with everybody else. Whereas if you're analyzing, say, the Indian law of tort, right? It's much harder. So I think starting off case comments is a good way to practice writing and also to have something interesting to say about something new, which can also help in then having it published and so on. So I'd say begin with that, and then as you're more comfortable, you grow into writing more challenging stuff and more elaborate stuff. How has legal education helped in writing? So I think that it is basically much like education in physics or engineering. Will make sure that when you write fiction, that part of it is completely correct. So you will get your dimensions of your engineering works correct. Similarly, legal education trains you to see the way that laws basically constitute the plumbing, the architecture of the world, and just how much of social behavior then is dependent on the legal structures, and of course vice versa. So again, in writing, you'll always be aware of that, and that will play a role in what you do. So it's just more being just aware of how that field is a part of social reality, and then making sure that your writing is then incorporates that in that understanding. I think it's something at a very perhaps subconscious level, almost not even conscious. It's more just using that to make sure your world building is internally consistent. Yeah, so the shifts in style and tone. So I think like I said, it requires unlearning because I'll just repeat I think the point I made, which is that the defining feature of good legal writing is directness, right? So this is the truth, and these are all the arguments I'm making to support that truth in the most direct and shortest way possible. And that is a legal brief, right? Whereas fiction is all about ambiguity, about asking the question, not answering it, asking it, shifting perspectives, all of that, right? So I think that is, and that of course, shows in the style. But I think if you're aware of what you're doing with the piece of fiction, then automatically like that will come. Like you'll find yourself changing your style to suit that. Of course, it will require effort and work, but that I think that's the main thing to keep in mind. And yeah, I think changing style is always, it's a challenge. But again, there's no like short-term answer there apart from just like trying to diversify as much as you can and through practice. I mean, my first two novels are in the very much sort of like high fantasy SF style, the epic style. This is a much more grounded or humorous sort of thing. So yeah, it's always good to experiment, I think, with writing, and having good readers and editors will make sure that you don't go too far off the track while doing that.
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned that it's like a muscle, so you keep on working on it. My question specifically with the present time, because with the advancements of short form content, especially in the social media, the attention span has driven down as well. So one question I have for you is, have you personally struggled with it? And the fact that people who are now getting in, the distraction is way more than what it was, let's say, 10 years ago. So how should one sleep, or rather how should mold themselves to sort of adapt towards long form articles?
My question was, you said there's no way of knowing whether your thing is being read and how popular it is. The online space
in advance. Of course, once you write it, you will know.
Okay.
You can't predict,
predict.
its reception.
But can't you also use analytics, for example, in the online space, and then try and temper your writing? It takes a lot of research and analysis. That's one thing. Second thing is it wiser to write something that you are aware about? Say you're a science student, write about science, or to jump into literature. Or if you want to, how easy or difficult is a shift?
Thank you so much for this session, and I wanted to ask that basically how can you maintain continuity in your writing process, because I like to write a lot, both fiction and non-fiction, but I find that I can only write when I'm feeling inspired. I basically cannot move the plot forward or cannot get the words out of my mouth.
So I think starting with that, it really, everybody has their own process. So for me, non-fiction is a continuous thing, so I do it like all the time. With fiction, I wouldn't say inspired, but like for me, it comes in bursts, right? So it'll be maybe 2 weeks of writing 10,000, 20,000 words, but nothing else. I do nothing else in those 2 weeks. I'm just like writing because that's what's happening, and then 3 months of like dry spell. But I think what's important is that even in those 3 months, you're at the desk, so words may not come, but you're still there, like and you're still trying. So if you wait for inspiration, it won't come. But if you practice at it, and if you're like if you're looking out for it, then because you can't tell when it'll come, right? So even when you're not writing fiction, just having that time of the day where you are like at the desk, and your file is open and you are thinking about your story or novella or novelette or novel, even though there are no words, but still, I think that's really important there, to give you that continuity and to then ensure that when it comes, you're ready for the inspiration. Right? So I'd say that that's important. Analytics. So I think that it's possible, right? So it's something that also in genre fiction, people do this a lot. They write to the trend. So there was a trend at some point in fantasy, for example, of sapphic fantasy, and then there was a trend of decolonial fantasy, and then there was a trend of romantasy, which is right now a trend. and you can do that. But normally, again, people can't predict trends, and by the time you finish writing your novel, it'll be the next trend, right? So I think something similar for analytics as well, right? You can try and use that, but by the time you finish your writing, it might have already changed. So I would say that write what write what you actually think is something you want to write. Of course, that doesn't mean you write something completely inaccessible. Broadly within the general domain of things people read or be interested in reading. But yeah, like without too much attention to whether you are writing to a market, because you can't predict the market, and so many other things go into it, right? Like something as basic as where a bookshop decides to place your book. Is it the first thing people see when they come into the bookshop? So you look at Book Hive on Church Street, right? So there are like these 10 books that you see when you walk in. Is it there, or is it somewhere at the back, right? And has the publisher paid the bookshop owner for that? So there's things that you can't control that, right? So again, don't write to that metric, because that's not going to be something which is within your control. So what was the question again?
Second question was, should you write something? Excuse me. That you've been trained for. If you're a science.
Oh yeah. So no, I think like it's really. I mean, you should be able to write whatever again you want to write. Of course, it is easier to write something that you've been trained in because you know the vocabulary. Writing something you're not trained in requires research. So as long as you do the research, it's fine. So there are people with no training in physical sciences who have written excellent science fiction novels, and there are people with no training in anthropology who have written like fantastic social science oriented novels. Yeah, it's just about doing the research and making sure that you've got that right. So you had a question?
My question was about the advancement of the short form content.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that look, you obviously it is something many people are struggling with, and it makes you need to know what those platforms are and how it works. So something like TikTok, how it works. So other similar forums and stuff, and use them to the extent that you can. So I use Twitter to just publicize the work, right? So that here is the work, and maybe summarize its core idea in one sentence to fit within the 140 to 280 character limit. Similarly, TikTok of course is banned, but those who use it can use it to again summarize what they're doing. But I think beyond that, if you're writing this kind of thing, which is an in-depth critical analysis of anything, of the courts, of adjudication, of law, of the constitution, you will not be able to break it down to the bite-sized level. It's not possible without losing and sacrificing a ton of nuance. So there, I think you have to trust your readers to come and find you, right? So as long as you're writing in a clear way and tackling issues that are important in an accessible way, you have to trust the readers to have the patience to read that in the age of attention spans that are short, and of course not everybody will. I think still there are enough people who are willing to read stuff like legal blogs, right? Like people do read legal blogs, so it's not that people aren't reading it. So I think I would say use those social media platforms to get the word out, and perhaps to sort of summarize the content what you're writing. But the actual writing still has to be that long form, right? It can't be less than that. You can't communicate the idea. You can't analyze C70 judgment in a TikTok video. It's not possible. It's just, I mean, it's like a 70-year long history, right? So how will you do that? So yeah.
Just people who haven't asked. 1, 2. After that. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask that. A label like me putting across my voices in social media now. So I just want to know that how can I put across my point and not to offend someone? Yeah. That is my now big
and one full book on it.
called blasphemous or something,
So one of the things, major problems I face while writing is I use a lot of jargons, because my writing involves, my work involves a lot of writing. So my first draft is filled with big words, and the next and subsequent drafts might be lucid much more, but then the first draft is always filled with lucid words. So I wanted to know about, did you ever face that difficulty in your formative years, and how did you tackle it?
Hi. So I have been an avid reader, and for the longest time I've been wanting to write.
Yeah.
And like I finally figured probably my write of styling would be more on a polemic style, and
Yeah.
being an atheist, probably I would want to write more about religion
Yeah.
and also the current affairs that's going on in the country. And I was just wondering, how far can I push the freedom of expression
Right.
through writing, right? Because it's just a very
Yeah.
controversial. I don't
Yeah.
want to be another Salman Rushdie.
Yeah.
So that, and you also said that you tend to be brief, or so when I'm writing, should I just focus on what I want to communicate, or should I be respectful of the reader's time, or how does this work?
And these are really I think impossible to answer without seeing what the writing is, right? So as far as the first question goes, it depends entirely on how much risk appetite you have, So yeah, and obviously you don't want to be possible and stuff. So maybe get someone to vet the piece once just to make sure that it can't be construed to be breaking law, stuff like that. But beyond that, it's just a question of how much you want to risk and what you want to how much you want to put yourself out there for. I think it's just that. And as far as again, the second point is really there's no one size fits all. So I'd say again the best ways to read in the genre that you are going to write in. So if polemic is your thing, then read the best polemics. So starting with the Pericles' funeral speech in the Peloponnesian War. It's there a brief speech.
Hitchens is more.
Sorry?
Christopher Hitchens is more.
Well, yeah. So Hitchens is more modern. Yeah. So there's that. So, yeah. So just read in the genre and then see what works and what's working there, and then you'll know And of course, ultimately it's your own style. You're not imitating anybody, but this is a good way to really to start and to understand the way that this style of writing works. I just say perhaps focus on that. What was the question there? Yeah, can you just repeat?
Usage of jargon.
Yeah. Again, this is you just have to go through the piece carefully and say, okay, is this word something that a person who doesn't have access to vocabulary will understand or not? And if it's not, then just stop it, right? So unless there's no other way, right? So yeah, I mean, you can't write, say, a legal piece without using some legal term. Right? It's not possible. But beyond that, just cut them out to the maximum extent possible. It's a conscious endeavor. Just know that, just imagine a reader is I think this is the standard phrase, a person who reads a newspaper, right? A curious person who reads a newspaper. That's your that's the reader. Of course, these days people don't, people get the news from other places. But yeah, that was the classic audience that people used to say was that the curious person who reads newspaper. Right? So if they can get it, then that's that's what you're aiming at. On the question there on offense, I mean, it's not, you'll always offend somebody online. It's not possible to not. I have been cancelled twice on Twitter. I think one was many years ago I made a very flippant remark on how the sorting hat in Harry Potter is like the caste system. So then people got very upset, and for 48 hours, I was cancelled. And then the second time was when I worked on the sub-classification judgment in the Supreme Court. Some people are still angry about that. After many months, they still send angry tweets. So you can be doing your job, right? And somebody will get angry. So that don't worry about offending people online unless you're going out of your way to offend them, which again is not. I'd say there's no point. I mean, don't do that. But if you're doing your thing and people get offended, I mean, I guess listen to them and try and understand why. But yeah, don't beyond that you can't. Yeah, always people are offended by stuff you're saying. So you can't change that fact about online interaction. Also because Twitter and all are meant to escalate. Right? I mean, the entire algorithm thrives off escalation. You say something, somebody says something back, then you escalate, they escalate. So yeah, it's just meant for that. So just avoid that whole rabbit hole.
The last round, whoever's not asked. 1, 2. Anybody who has not asked a question? Yes. Huh? Yeah, 3. Yeah, not you. Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Hi Gautam, nice to see you here. I'm a legal journalist, so I do write and edit, and more specifically about the Supreme Court a lot. And I do see a point on the gratification it gives. Sometimes it's almost like an addiction. Even after work hours, I see myself thinking about an edit that I couldn't crack, and it's addictive, right? But I think every couple of months there comes a moment where I'm just like, okay, but this is all too much. Like, to what end is any of this?
Mm.
Because it's not enough that
Yeah.
you've understood this
Yeah.
complicated thing the court has said
Yeah.
and simplified it,
Yeah.
but you have to present it in a way that's SEO friendly.
Yeah.
And that's not enough. You need to tweet about it and make your work available.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, and somewhere along it begins to feel like the effort to reward ratio in this space is, because we're also seeing our friends and contemporaries doing much better in terms of like where they are in terms of life, family, money, etc. How do you sort of ground yourself and center yourself and bring that balance back on days like that? And secondly, on Twitter especially, I feel like writing on Twitter is underrated as hell. This is something I'm very recently warming up to and trying to understand. But where you are currently today, do you find that you feel the pressure to have a take all the time because a lot of people look to your work and what you have to say? And how you cope with that pressure? I'm sure a lot of it comes from muscle memory, as you said. I'm sure like now when you have read a judgment, you have your 5-6 points of what your take on it is. But in your earlier days, how did you sort of deal with this?
Who had a question? Oh yeah, you said.
So hello, I'm a law student and I'm in my first year. So my question to you was, when you're dealing with concepts like marital rape, right? But there's a lot of literature about it, or there are a lot of opinions. Some say it should be enforced, some say it shouldn't. Or in case of like recognizing marriage for homosexuals. So but there is a lot of societal discourse and asset polarization among such topics. How do you kind of create a novel argument, right? And how do you kind of cite them? Because you can't really do that. A lot of people will say that, oh, family is an institution. But you cannot merely cite one person or one author who said this specifically. Or you cannot be like, oh, but that does not like ensure gender equality, like it's not fair. Or does not justify why the rape law is present in the first place. So how do you kind of navigate that? And second thing is, when you are a student, like how, as like similar to the question that was asked before, how do you kind of go about making sure that whatever you're contributing to your work is legitimate? Like, how do you make sure that you kind of write well in such a way?
So you mentioned that while writing we have very less tangible effects, but sometimes it does have some impact. Just wanted to know, in your experience, have you seen any tangible impact on an institutional level in India or outside India, where legal scholars have written extensively and has led to some sort of a movement which has started, or general public opinion which has become so significant that institutions have had to take note?
I think in India the classic example is the Mathura case, right? That's the letter written by the jurist, the Chief Justice of India, which then kicked off a thing. I think that's the example that people often cite. I think from my experience, I have a couple of examples. One is that I wrote a blog post on the Beggary Act, which was there in many states. So there's a lawyer in Jammu and Kashmir who then converted that blog post to a petition and then filed it in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court. And the High Court struck down the High Court Act by relying on the blog and on the petition. So it became this nice thing where the argument was first made on the blog, it then became a legal brief, it then became a judgment. That rarely happens. This is good luck. I mean, it's just like so I think that it can happen, right? So I think that's one thing. But has writing led to a social movement? I mean, I don't know, right? So in India, I'm not sure. Like there are examples, elsewhere. So Jose Rizal, the Filipino, entire Philippine War of Independence, people say was triggered by his book, which was about the colonial oppression of the Philippines. Uncle Tom's Cabin, apparently book that built a civil war. Yeah, so you have examples of writing leading to massive social consequences. Not always in a good way, right? Of course, it can work both ways. Writing can also do ill as well as good. But yeah, I think it's possible. I just think, like I said, you can't predict it, right? So when you're writing something, you don't know if it'll set off something or not, and 99% of the time it will not, right? So you don't write for the 1%. You write for if it was to be, then it would be a good outcome. So on the question of marital rape and same-sex marriage, so I don't think. I mean, look, you will not have a new argument to make for these things. I mean, arguments on both sides have been made now for decades, right? So just in the abstract, you won't have a new argument to make on that, and it's not maybe in debates and all. Obviously, you try and pitch the argument in a novel way. But as such, there's nothing new to say on these issues. I think what does happen is, of course, when a court decides it, right? So if a court decides the equal marriage case like last year, or if a court decides the marital rape case, then you have like a judicial artifact, right? So then you can actually analyze the case and say, okay, look, what does it say and all that. But I think in the abstract, you wouldn't have something new to say about these, unless of course you're a philosophical genius, or you've thought about that for like 30 years and then you find something new to say. How do we do legitimate writing? Again, just make sure that you've covered your literature, right? So you have like libraries in colleges, you have your online databases. Make sure that you've covered the literature, you've followed the footnotes to where they go, and then you know that you've basically covered your bases, and then it'll be fine. It'll be like get the basic level of competence. Yeah, on the like sort of reward effort ratio. Yeah, this is like a big problem, and as a fiction writer, it's a very big problem, because nowadays with the marketing budgets being slashed and basically being top heavy, where like the top writers get all the benefits, you basically are your own publicist as well. Which is not to say that there aren't good publicists. There are. For my novel presently, there's been fantastic marketing work done. But not only that happens, and that's rare if you get it, and that's great. But also you're supposed to be doing it yourself. So tweeting about the book, posting on Insta, posting artistic photos about the book, right? So it's a constant thing to get eyeballs, right? Because there is no infrastructure left that would then do that for you. So it is a big pain, but I think like the only thing is to I think that what helps is that when there are people who have read your work and have told you about it, that carries you through like the bad days as well, because then you know that at least like somebody is positively impacted by the work and has enjoyed it. I think that really helps carry you through that bit. And what was Twitter? Was it question about Twitter?
Yeah, about having a take and sort of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's the pressure initially, but you soon realize that it's a dead end, right? So, and you realize that I mean, it's not essential to have a take on everything. If you have something to say, say it. But otherwise, I think I figured pretty quickly that giving into that is just a disaster thing. But then where do you stop, right? Like, what do you not have a take on then, right? So I've just stopped, and I think life is much nicer not having to give takes on stuff. Unless when you really want to, or if you have time to think and then write a full piece, then that's fine. But the instant takes, I try not to anymore.
I think we can have it after the discussion. Thank you so much, Gautam.
I'll just say that there's a 6 p.m. Champaka discussion with Akar Patel on the novel, so if anyone's interested, you can just move there after this. But no pressure.
It's on the new book sentence. So those of you who are interested, please go. Thank you so much for being so patient and answering, so many rounds of questions. It's been a really insightful discussion. Thank you so much. And those of you who still have questions, you can maybe catch him after this. I hope everybody signed that paper. Basically, that's our mailing list. Yeah, our mailing list. Where is that? Has everybody signed the email? If those of you want to get in touch, if you haven't, then just get in touch with Aishwarya, me, or Sadeep. You didn't get a paper? You guys got it? Okay.